Today's show is all about smart cities. Hello and welcome to The Day Before Tomorrow, the show where we look at the challenges, the opportunities and the innovations that are happening in different industries right now. Over the course of the series, we're looking at health, entertainment, education, retail, money, and the topic of today's show, which is smart cities. Now, this is an area that not everyone's aware of. It's basically how we use technology to manage and govern our environment. It involves everyone from national government to local government to businesses to citizens. And as you'll see, there's some debate around whether it's exclusively around cities at all. So to get us started on the subject of smart cities, let's talk to some smart people.
So at the moment, people are very conscious of challenges facing cities, challenges of resilience in the face of increasingly extreme weather, economic competition as emerging economies around the world grow, and social mobility. Most of our cities don't provide opportunity as equally as we would like them to. The starkest proof point for that is the fact that life expectancy between the richest and poorest parts of the same city in the UK usually varies by about 10 to 20 years. That's an astonishing discrepancy. And so in smarter cities, what we're trying to do is to use technology to tackle those problems. That might range from using sensors and analytics to measure and predict traffic flow in cities and help traffic managers to prevent congestion building up, which is a barrier to economic growth. Or it might involve using analytic technology to understand the case notes that social care caseworkers write and that teachers write, and use them to provide better insight to people who are helping children who are having difficulty at school to get over those difficulties and have a good educational experience.
I think the sort of image that it conjures up for people is this kind of dynamically optimized real-time system of interlocking parts. So a beautifully clockwork sort of Newtonian vision of the city where everything is just in time accurate because of very accurate data. But I don't know how that's going to work, really.
I think smart cities historically were talked about very much in the context of infrastructural advancements made by cities in order to attract more people to them. I think more and more today, there's a huge infrastructural component, which is part of the smart city definition. But an even bigger part is perhaps the social and experience capital generated for and by the people of that city towards achieving their objectives.
There already is pervasive technology that we can start to use by integrating it and connecting it in different ways so that we can start to develop positive feedback loops. And that's what a real connected city is to me. It's using the devices that people have already got to motivate people to be the best they can be within the city, because cities are all about people and the connectivity between people, and that's not about technology. That's about motivation.
Humans have been living in cities for millennia. So why is it that the idea of smart cities is suddenly a thing?
Cities are very complex systems. Cities recently became the dominant human habitat. For the first time ever, more than half of humanity lived in cities. And that's only going to continue. Cities are now becoming megacities, 10, 20 million people, large systems. Systems of that magnitude are complicated, obviously, or complex, depending on which version of that works. And you have the two elements. There's infrastructure complexity. There's just not enough space to get enough people around fast enough to feed this growing organism. And then you have the dynamics of interpersonal behaviour. Then you have human side of systems. And they're interrelated, obviously. They're part of the same bigger system. But human beings are quite hard to understand. And technology and infrastructure is sort of at least something you can draw.
It is very rare that I think you will see a smart city kind of appear in the fashion of flipping a switch and all of a sudden, lo and behold, you have a smart city. In fact, most of those projects have actually failed because what they don't have is the real world challenges of existing cities, which have to deal with the 10, 12, 18 million people, which have to deal with the existing pressures of business. And most cities that have actually tried to build, and they will come, have almost always found themselves in a situation where it was built, it took too long, and by the time it was done, it was fit for no purpose, and nobody came. So for me, most smart city examples that are powerful are thinking about examples in existing urban areas.
There seems to be two approaches to smart cities. One looks at infrastructure to get things working more effectively. The other looks at behaviour change to encourage people to use the systems in a better way. But let's look at some examples of how that works in the real world.
A great example of a smarter city would be Rio de Janeiro at the moment, where, led by the city's mayor, Eduardo Paes, they've brought a set of agencies that support and deliver services in the city together into a single control organisation, single building, and what we've helped Rio to do is integrate the information feeds from all of those city systems as well as national and international open data feeds so that everybody working in the city has a common, up-to-date, in-depth picture of what's happening. And we also distribute that insight through social media channels so that the wider population are involved and they can make their own decisions for it.
Vertical farming and vertical gardens are starting now to introduce this notion that parks and landscape does not necessarily only have to exist in the horizontal plane and compete with buildings and other infrastructure for space, but could exist on the sides of these things that historically would have meant that they were not open for ecological use or social benefit. A great example of this is the gardens along the abandoned train tracks in New York called the High Line, which I think are just a fantastic example of a city developing something that was otherwise historically derelict and changing it into a fantastic space for people to kind of share and collaborate.
There's one particular behaviour change project which I thought was extraordinary. It was by UCL, University College London. They were trying to figure out that if you take personal data from personal behaviours, if you then put that into public space, can you change people's behaviours in that way? So they went to a street called Tidy Street in Brighton, and they got all of the houses to sign up for this project. Every night, all of the people in the houses received a text to say, go and check how much electricity you've used that day. So they'd send the data of how much electricity they'd used back to headquarters. Headquarters would then turn that data into an infographic. And then the infographic would be chalk artisted down the road, street size, so that as people came out, the first thing they saw was how they were doing compared to other people. They aggregated data so they could see how their street was doing in comparison with the street next door and the street next door. So it's very much looking at how it's using the sort of keeping up with the Joneses concept. But there was a drop of 16% in energy usage over a month.
Behaviour change is a really interesting area because humans are glitchy, unpredictable, and hard to operate. And that's why there's been a lot of interest in behavioural economics in recent years. The idea of using nudges or triggers to modify group behaviour. And there's a really interesting experiment happening around that very area, right here in London.
So the air quality in London is the worst of any other capital city. 14,000 people died last year of particulate pollution. 7,000 of them were in London. The European Commission has just taken the government to court because they're not doing their duty to British citizens. £24 billion is spent every year on the repercussions from air quality. 18 illnesses are associated with bad air quality. It's not a good situation. And the more research you do, the more frightening it becomes. So we're developing a behaviour change project, which is about trying to get people to walk more and drive less. And by doing so, become healthier and happier. And the streets will become safer. And we're assuming, because people are walking more, that the air quality will get better, which will in turn make cities healthier. So we've designed the entire process with communities in Brixton and various other stakeholders throughout the process. And what we've ended up with is a very simple game We've decided to look at children because every single stakeholder we talked to said, if you want to change adults' behaviours, you need to get the kids on your side, because happy kids, happy parents. So we went into schools and we asked the kids what kind of things they enjoyed doing. They told us they really enjoy Candy Crush. Candy Crush is obviously a really addictive game. So we've redeveloped something which is extremely similar to Candy Crush, which the kids will download. So we're assuming by getting the kids to love the idea of their parents walking, we might in that way start to change their behaviours too.
Let's look at another pretty ambitious experiment, this time at a country level. Although it's a small country, it's got a massive vision. Guernsey wants to be the best place in the world to live by 2020.
We started a movement in Guernsey. It was kind of two people in a coffee shop talking about why don't we use this kind of same mechanisms behind the Apollo program, which was ridiculous. In the 60s, they said, we'll try and put a man on the moon, and they achieved that in 8 years. I mean, think about the technology that was available then. But the really interesting thing about that is it created mass alignment of a whole country. The whole country believed that it was possible, and therefore all the kind of details that would normally people argue and squabble over disappeared, and you saw an explosion of innovation to actually achieve a big mission. And so we thought, well, why don't we do our own version of the Apollo program, and how do we align a country around this idea of being the best place to live on Earth as a reason to innovate, as a reason to let go of the past, as a reason to try bold things. Because we ultimately all live in a place like that for life reasons, and what better thing to do than actually create the best place to live? Because it actually means something to us. Economy doesn't really mean anything to people. Life does. You know, everybody asks us what projects are we doing, and it's really not about us, as in this core team of people, what projects we are doing. Actually, all we do is give people permission. Everybody deep inside them knows what they want to do to improve where they live, but for some reason they're waiting. And really, the truth is you don't need to wait. And we don't even know some of the projects that are going on because it's kind of a virus. You know, once you give the community permission to improve, then people just start doing it. Or you look at something like a bus transport, you know, a bus app, you know, so you can see where the buses are, how do you get people out of their cars and transport. You know, for a government to be able to produce something like that can take 3 years, lots of permissions, strategy documents and things like that. For the community to build something like that, it can take 3 weeks. And so the interesting thing is we have in Guernsey all these developers and all this amazing resource that's currently watching TV in the evenings, and now we're starting to bring together all those resources to actually build platforms for the community.
Clearly, government has an important role to play in this smart cities business, but they also have the potential to slow it down to a snail's pace. So just how should they get involved?
I think government at both local and national level has several roles to play in the world of smarter cities. So in one, it's simply of leadership, of setting out that this is an important set of ideas, that we face challenges that we really have to focus on, and that technology is an important tool in addressing those challenges. And I think the UK government in establishing a Smart Cities Forum is, you know, really taking some leadership there. I think there are legislative and policy issues that if addressed, could accelerate the speed at which smarter cities technologies can be adopted by cities and with which they can benefit from them.
So I think for me, I think about smart cities and their responsibilities in the context of who are the people responsible for the platform and who are the people responsible for the individual applications on the platform. And I think the responsibility of the individual applications is down to the initiative of every single one of us who thinks that our experience can be made slightly more frictionless, slightly more pleasant through our journey through a city. And then the role of the platform is to start to regulate the broad things, the infrastructural components, not just along physical infrastructure, but software and data infrastructure that allow you to think about how you can connect with a system.
I think the government can do more. I think that legislation and top-down is very important, but I think that that needs to operate alongside citizen empowerment programs like these, which are more about reward and recognition.
So governments are making an effort to use technology as a way to engage with citizens. And social media platforms are obviously a good way of doing that. But it's got to be about more than just using Facebook as a broadcasting platform. You need to be listening as much as talking.
So the citizen impact of social media in government is absolutely wonderful. We've been able to use crowdsourced platforms and things like Twitter to get the word out and talk to them on a regular basis about programs for unemployment insurance, perhaps, or to answer questions in real time, to gather data and information on where a pothole may have just popped up in their area. We've really implemented social in a multitude of ways in order to give the end goal citizen a voice. If you look at the way that social has sort of sparked a revolution across the globe, it gives every single person the ability to be recognized for what they find is important. One of the challenges of that, of course, with government is that although we can have that conversation and see it happen in real time, the amount of turnaround time that it takes to implement the change is not necessarily always appropriate for what our consumers are looking for.
Governments work at a speed that's entirely different to the rest of the world. So is it even possible for them to be innovative?
At a macro level, because we have so many large companies now trying to be digital, we're seeing innovation come from every corner, and that's good. Where we won't see innovation is government. Government resists innovation by definition, and in fact, there's some good to that. In a world where change is slow, the government is a nice modifying or moderating factor to make sure that change doesn't get out of hand. The government, do they need to disrupt themselves? Certainly. But maybe what they need more is to learn how to stand out of the way, provide the basic guidelines and infrastructure to make sure nobody hurts anyone else too badly, and let us innovate.
One of the keys to governments allowing their citizens to innovate is to provide open data and just to say, here we are, here's everything we've got, here we know, go and play with it. And you'd be amazed what actually starts to happen when you allow people to play with data and what services they build for the community with that data.
Amazing things can come from releasing data and letting individuals and companies do interesting stuff with it. A perfect example of that is the brilliant points sign. This is something that really does put the smart in smart cities.
The idea behind points is to create something that looks like it fits in much more naturally, so it feels like it's appropriate for the scenario. And so it's based off of an old directional sign, that kind of look, but the arms move, and the screens are all LED based, and we can pull in dynamic content from transit or just local coffee shops, and they can put up their content. And the big idea is just to really create the most dynamic wayfinding possible that can update on the fly throughout up to the minute, really. When we go about designing a product for citizens in a city, I think we focus a lot on the fact that they are lazy, to be honest, in the sense of we don't want to create something that they have to go out of their way and, okay, there's a thing over there, I got to walk over to it, I have to start touching it to get something out of it. There's actually something really strong in the passive nature of putting things on the sidewalk that people can see from, 2 blocks away potentially. And so that's really where the design of points came from, was trying to figure out how you can reach the maximum number of people without having to make them stop.
Let me fill you in on a little bit of jargon. In the world of tech, you'll often hear the term API. It stands for Application Program Interface. But that probably doesn't help you very much. Think about it as a socket in a piece of software. You can use the API to access the information and functionality that's already been built. For example, if you use the API for a weather site and you enter your location, it will return things like the temperature, the wind speed, and whether it's raining or not. And that means that anyone with just a little bit of programming knowledge can very quickly build something new and interesting.
I think of them very simply as something that allows you to dock with another system or another bank of information that allows you to do something really interesting with it. So if you think about it quite simplistically, TfL in the days gone by exposed all of their data of when trains were coming and going and how late were they and how quickly they were going to arrive and what have you to the world in the form of this API. And then various different people could dock with that, get access to that train information and start to do a lot more clever things over and above that information.
Every time that a city opens up a specific, transportation API or something of that sort, you always end up seeing a whole slew of people producing, developing new content, new apps, and things that people can use. For us, it's how we want this thing to run. We want to be able to pull in all that data that's coming in right from the source. And so the more that people are opening up, the more clearly a bigger win it is for everyone involved, including the city and all of its residents.
So governments are held back by their lumbering size, their layers of bureaucracy, and their lack of vision. Let's see what's possible when they're small, nimble, and visionary.
Companies really like test beds. So Guernsey is a 65,000 people country. And so what companies are really interested in is how do you prove that a new system or technology can work at country scale to provide evidence for other countries to start shifting towards those technologies. So you look at something like driverless cars, for instance. There's some really interesting legislative challenges with driverless cars. How would you get legislation changed without live test beds somewhere in the world? Or you look at healthcare in terms of how that's really, really shifting in terms of biotech. How do you get those into society scale executions so that larger countries can actually do it? And so there's a real, legislation is one of the biggest barriers to the world being able to move from the past to the future. And small countries can shift legislation much, much faster than large countries.
So you may have noticed that the term smart cities is a bit of a misnomer. We've just been looking at the idea of smart countries, and earlier we're looking at smart communities and even smart homes. So it's no surprise that the cities part of the name is generating a bit of debate.
I've served as a Rural Affairs Minister for England, and indeed very recently I stopped being Shadow Rural Affairs Minister in the House of Lords. So I think quite hard about how we can make rural areas more viable. There's a fantastic quality of life to be had living in our more remote peripheral areas, but you are on the periphery. At the same time, I observe the pressures of urbanisation, particularly in London, where the population is growing by the equivalent of 2 double-decker buses every day, and it's not sustainable. One of the things that I know about digital is it's redefining geography. It's redefining our sense of space because it's connecting us wherever we are with whoever we want anywhere in the world as long as they can get online. And that means there ought to be some opportunities. So you then think, well, should we manage a process of de-urbanisation as we move to a post-industrial age and look at how we could redefine the expectations of work? Others have done some really interesting thinking around the culture of presence in work. Too often, we measure an individual's productivity by whether or not they're sat at the desk. Why don't we just measure the productivity of people on their output, and whether they're doing a good job in terms of their deliverables? And they could do that from home.
We spend a lot of time debating whether smarter cities is really about cities or whether it's about cities and the wider ecosystem that they're part of, rural communities and the physical environment, or whether these ideas are actually just as applicable to communities in rural areas in their own right as they are in cities. And actually, I think the truth is that all of those things are true. Technology is broadly applicable in cities. Cities don't exist in isolation, though. They feed the wider national economy, and they are supported by vast supply chains of food and resources from the wider environment.
Because more and more, there is a school of thought that does start to say, well, maybe people don't need to congregate in cities because technology has allowed the virtualization of so many functions so that we start to see redistribution of people across very many more rural areas. And while I do think that that has some merit, I do think cities have always been the heart of where economies of great countries have evolved to, largely because the physical proximity to capital and other talent has always stimulated thinking and ideas far beyond our understanding in a logical process sense. And that kind of chemistry comes from the experience that cities have the ability to create. And for me, smarter cities have to create more of these magical experiences and reduce the friction that for those of us who've always lived in cities have had to grapple with for so many years.
Someone made a really interesting observation that most companies, when they get big, get less innovative. Cities are the opposite of that. Cities get more innovative the bigger they are, because there's more random interactions.
There's always going to be issues with the smart cities agenda. You'll often get lots of stakeholders who slow down the decision-making process, which is maybe a good thing when the repercussions of any decision will affect so many of us. But when it comes to smart cities, there's a lot more to consider than usual.
Two of the biggest challenges I see in more widely deploying smarter city ideas are creating the business models for them and creating trust. If you're looking to create an ability to invest time, materials and resources in an infrastructure or a project that's intended to improve economic growth or improve social mobility, then you need a business model to turn those outcomes into an investable opportunity. The second challenge, though, is perhaps deeper, and that's one of trust. I think any smart city idea needs to build trust in technology with its users, trust with the people who might invest in it.
I think you have to start to think about the governance of cities. You have to start to think about the participation of citizens in the governance of cities. I think you have to start to think about the quality of life, the social and intellectual capital. I think you have to start to think about things far beyond regional competitiveness and transportation and infrastructure, all of which have always been big criteria in the evaluation of cities and their value. And most importantly, I think you have to start thinking about all of these things in the collective experience that you as a city are trying to offer an individual.
Digital is not a guaranteed nirvana for anyone. There will be significant challenges that come because of digital disruption. Privacy is an obvious one that everyone has their attention on, but really, there will be significant adjustments that we have to make as a society, much the way we did when we went through the Industrial Revolution, much the way we did when we became literate and had the printed word available. There were negative impacts, and the job that we have as humans is to ameliorate the impacts that are negative, while at the same time reaching for the absolute most positive aspects of digital disruption and innovation.
We need experiments, and I think there are experiments occurring. I believe any massively polarized vision tends to be biased. So if it's a massive utopia or a dystopia, they're probably both untrue. It's going to be dirty and messy and faster and better.
Smart cities is an area with lots of opportunities for governments, for businesses, for citizens. But if we want to create something that's truly beneficial, we need to follow a number of principles.
Good smart cities project, I think, in large part, has to have a very clear set of objectives. I think that we're different than the historical objectives. So I think historical objectives were very focused around infrastructure. And even the early thinking around smart cities had a lot more focus on technology and on infrastructure. I think more evolved smart cities constructs have almost always focused on more dimensions around the intellectual and social capital, on the experience.
When thinking about smarter cities, I think first life, then place, then technology. Think about the people's lives in a city, think about the other characteristics of the place where those lives are carried out, and then think about the technology that might make those lives better. I think if we think technology first, we can come up with all sorts of grand schemes, but they're unlikely to really benefit the people in cities who are the most important.
Most technology innovation is actually pretty small. It's a swipe gesture here, or it's a socially enabled site there. But smart cities technology is something that can affect entire nations. And the best ideas can come from an individual or a small group of people, which means this is an opportunity for all of us. So my questions are, what would you like to change? And when are you going to start? Think big, because as Steve Jobs said, the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.